Hey guys, tonight we begin with something brewing hotter than the office coffee that somehow still tastes like betrayal. The story of the Boston Tea Party, the night a few hundred very cranky colonists decided the finest way to protest their taxes was to throw a truly staggering amount of someone else's tea into the sea. Not a metaphor, not a strongly worded letter, not a committee. An actual harbour turned into the world's largest, saltiest, most passive-aggressive cup of tea. Before we wade in, I want to say a genuine thank you to Charlotte, who suggested tonight's topic down in the comments. Your suggestions really do shape what we make here, and I read every single one, so please keep them coming. If you enjoy these little journeys into the past, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. No pressure whatsoever. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because somehow it is always 2 a.m. somewhere. The channel is also now over on Spotify, so if you'd rather drift off with only your ears and no glowing screen an inch from your face, the link is down in the description. And for the truly dedicated night owls, there's an 8-hour ad-free version waiting on the membership. Perfect for the nights when one story simply isn't long enough to outlast the ceiling you keep staring at. Now, dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and let your shoulders slide down from around your ears. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be taxed by a government, an entire ocean away that never once asked your opinion? Did colonists really care that much about tea? Or was it just the final straw balanced on a very tired, very grumpy camel? What exactly does one wear to a midnight act of treason? And could you keep a secret this enormous in a town where everyone knew everyone? Or would you fold the instant your neighbour offered you a warm biscuit and a knowing look? Well, you're about to find out. Congratulations. You've just woken up in Boston, and the year is 1773. Your tea is about to get very, very wet. So here you are, blinking awake in a narrow wooden house on a crooked little street, and the first thing you notice is that everything is damp. The sea does that. It creeps into the walls, the blankets, the bread, and quite possibly your soul. You're a colonist in one of the busiest ports in British America, which sounds glamorous until you realise it mostly means you smell fish before you smell breakfast. There is no alarm clock, just the town crier, church bells, and a rooster who has personal beef with you specifically. Let's start the day, shall we? Because in 1773, mornings in Boston aren't just a routine. It's the opening act of a very slow-motion rebellion, and you, my sleepy friend, are already running late. You roll off a mattress stuffed with straw or, if you're doing well for yourself, feathers. Though even the feathers seem to have opinions about your posture. The room is dim, lit only by whatever grey light manages to squeeze through the small, wavy panes of your window. Everything is made of wood, and everything creaks. The floor creaks, the stairs creak, the bed creaks, and you're fairly sure that at your age so do you. Somewhere below, someone is already up, poking at the fire and trying to coax it back to life from the sullen embers of last night. The town outside is stirring. You can hear it through the thin walls, cartwheels rattling over stone, a dog making its opinions known, the distant clang of a blacksmith who apparently believes sleep is for the weak. Boston doesn't ease into the morning so much as elbow you into it. There's no gentle transition, no snooze button, no soft playlist of ocean sounds. You already have the ocean. It's right there, and it never stops. And it smells like a fish market that lost a fight. You dress quickly because the house is cold and modesty demands layers anyway. A linen shirt, wool breeches, stockings, a waistcoat if you're respectable, and shoes with actual buckles, because this is a civilization now, thank you very much. It's a far cry from the barefoot mud-dwelling of centuries past. You are technically a modern person living in a modern town in a modern empire. You have newspapers, you have tea, you have opinions, and boy, are you about to have a lot more of them. But here's the thing about this particular morning, and every morning lately. There's a tightness in the air, a low hum of tension that has nothing to do with the weather. It's in the way people nod at each other on the street, a little too knowingly. It's in the clusters of men muttering outside the print shop. It's in the way the word tea has somehow become a loaded term, spoken with the same energy you might reserve for a swear word or an unpaid debt. Something is coming. Everyone feels it. Nobody says it out loud because saying it out loud makes it real. You splash some cold water on your face from a basin, which is the 18th century version of a refreshing morning shower, if a shower were 3 tablespoons of water that somehow found a way to be colder than the room. You blink. You sigh. You brace yourself for another day of being a loyal, hard-working, thoroughly taxed subject of His Majesty King George III, who lives in a palace across an ocean and has never once had to smell your harbour. Welcome to Boston. Welcome to 1773. Try not to start a war before lunch. Let's talk about your home, because you're going to be cold in it. Your house is timber, tight-packed against its neighbours, and heated by a single fireplace that treats warmth as more of a suggestion than a promise. There's no thermostat, no fluffy duvet, just a wool blanket and the strategic decision to sleep in your clothes. Windows, if you have real glass in them, are a status symbol, and they leak air like a gossip leaks secrets. You wake with a cold nose and the particular joy of stepping onto a wooden floor that has apparently been storing the entire winter inside it. It's like the medieval hut's respectable grandchild who got a job but still can't afford heating. The fireplace is the heart of the home, and like most hearts, it demands constant attention, or it simply stops. Every morning begins with the sacred ritual of reviving it, poking the ashes, coaxing a spark, feeding it kindling and blowing on it with the desperate patience of someone whose fingers have gone numb. Wood is money, so you don't burn it freely. You burn it grudgingly, one carefully rationed log at a time, while the fire radiates just enough heat to warm precisely the 1 square foot directly in front of it and nowhere else. Everyone in the family knows that spot. Everyone wants that spot. Wars have started over less. Your house, if you're a middling sort of Bostonian, has a few rooms, which feels positively luxurious. There's a main room downstairs for cooking, eating and living, and perhaps a chamber or 2 upstairs for sleeping. The furniture is sturdy and plain. A wooden table, some stools, a chest for storing your good linens and your bad secrets. If you're prosperous, maybe a proper bedstead with curtains you can draw against the draught, turning your bed into a small, stuffy fabric fortress. Those curtains aren't for privacy, they're for survival. Cooking happens right there in the same fireplace, over the flames, in heavy iron pots that weigh roughly as much as a small child. The whole house smells of wood smoke, tallow candles, and whatever's been simmering, which is a genuine upgrade from earlier eras, when the whole house smelled of wood smoke, tallow candles, and the livestock sleeping in the corner. Progress, friend. You've evolved. The animals now sleep in a separate building, and everyone is happier for it, especially the animals. Light is precious after dark. Candles are made of tallow, which is rendered animal fat, and they smell exactly as appetizing as that sounds. They gutter and drip and give off a weak, wobbling glow that makes reading a small act of heroism. Beeswax candles smell better and burn cleaner, but they cost more, so you save those for company, for church, and for pretending you're fancier than you are. The rest of the time you go to bed when it gets dark because there is very little else to do and the fire won't watch itself. And so your home is a place of small, constant negotiations with the cold. You stuff rags into cracks. You hang heavy cloth over doorways. You wear a nightcap not for fashion but because a shocking amount of body heat escapes through your head and you'd like to keep it. You've made peace with the fact that from October to April, you will simply be a little bit cold at all times, everywhere, forever. Still, it's a house. It's yours, or close enough. It keeps the rain out most days and the wind out some days. And in a town about to tip into open defiance of the largest empire on earth, a warmish room and a locked door start to feel less like comfort and more like a small, stubborn act of hope. Time to step outside and mind where you step. Boston's streets are a chaotic tangle of cobblestone, mud, horse traffic, and the occasional wandering pig who considers this his kingdom. It's loud, it's crowded, and it smells like a low tide argued with a stable and nobody won. You've got merchants shouting, sailors swaggering, apprentices sprinting on errands, and everywhere the salt-heavy breath of the harbour. This is a town of maybe 16,000 souls crammed onto a lumpy little peninsula, which means everyone knows everyone, and everyone is absolutely in everyone's business. Think small-town energy with big city smells. It's the kind of place where you cannot sneeze without 3 people knowing about it before you finished. The streets themselves were not so much planned as they were suggested, apparently by cows. They wind and fork and dead-end without warning, following old paths worn by animals and habit long before anyone thought to name them. There's no grid, no logic, no helpful signage. You navigate by landmark and by memory. Turn left at the church, right at the tavern with the crooked sign, straight on past the house where the man who owes you money is very obviously pretending not to be home. Underfoot, it's an adventure. Some streets are cobbled, which is charming until you turn an ankle. Most are packed dirt, which is fine until it rains, at which point they become a rich sucking mud that tries to steal your shoes and occasionally succeeds. Mixed into all this is the generous contribution of the town's horses, cattle and pigs, who do not concern themselves with public sanitation. You learn to walk with your eyes down. Everyone does. It's less humility and more self-defence. The harbour is always there, at the edge of everything, defining the whole town. Masts crowd the waterfront like a leafless forest, ships from every corner of the empire creaking at their moorings. The wharves stretch out into the water like long wooden fingers, piled with barrels, crates and cargo. This is where Boston makes its money, where the tea will soon arrive, and where, though you don't know it yet, a great deal of that tea will shortly be going for an unplanned swim. The people are a whole cast of characters. There are the merchants in their good coats, walking briskly and looking important. There are the dock workers and sailors, rough-handed and loud, smelling of tar and salt and hard labour. There are good wives with baskets, haggling at the market stalls. There are apprentices, always running, always late, always being yelled at by a master somewhere behind them. And now, threaded through the whole scene, there are the redcoats, the British soldiers, standing at their posts and pretending not to notice the glares. And oh, the talk. Boston runs on conversation the way its ships run on wind. Every corner has its knot of men debating the latest outrage from London. Every tavern hums with argument. News passes mouth to mouth faster than any newspaper, growing more dramatic with each retelling, until a minor tax dispute in Parliament becomes, by the third tavern, a personal insult to every freeborn Bostonian, and possibly their grandmothers. It's crowded, it's dirty, it's gossipy, and it's absolutely buzzing with a restless, crackling energy. This is a town that feels perpetually on the verge of either a festival or a riot, and lately the odds have been shifting heavily toward riot. You pull your coat tighter, nod to a neighbour who already knows where you're going and why, and step into the current of it all. In Boston, you're never lost and never alone. You're simply one more thread in a very tightly wound, very flammable little town. Now, how do you actually survive here? Because bills, or their 18th century equivalent, do not pay themselves. Boston runs on the sea. You might be a merchant, a dock worker, a cooper hammering barrels, a shipwright, a printer, a rope maker, or a shopkeeper selling imported goods to people who complain about the prices. Whatever you do, your fortune rises and falls with the ships in the harbour. Trade is the town's heartbeat, and Britain is the one holding the stethoscope, and increasingly the wallet. It's a bit like working for a company headquartered so far away that head office has never once seen your face but somehow still finds new ways to reach into your paycheck. If you're a merchant, your life is a constant gamble against wind, weather, and paperwork. You buy goods, you ship them, you pray they arrive, and you pray harder that the price hasn't collapsed by the time they do. A single storm can sink a season's profit to the bottom of the Atlantic. A single new tax can turn a healthy margin into a loss. You spend your days at the wharves and the counting house, poring over ledgers, chasing debts, and developing the particular stomach ulcer that comes free with the profession. If you work the docks, your body is your fortune, and it's a fortune that depreciates fast. You haul, you lift, you load and unload cargo until your back files a formal complaint. The work is seasonal and unreliable, ebbing and flowing with the ships, and when trade slows, so does your income, and so does your ability to eat. It's honest work, back-breaking work, and it leaves you with strong arms, a permanent squint, and a deep personal grudge against anything that interferes with the flow of goods into the harbour. Say, for instance, a tax. The skilled trades hold a bit more dignity and a bit more security. The cooper builds the barrels that everything ships in. The shipwright builds the ships themselves, great skeletons of timber rising in the yards. The printer sets type late into the night, and lately he's the busiest man in town because outrage sells. The blacksmith, the tanner, the cordwainer, the silversmith like a certain Mr. Revere. Each command a genuine skill, an apprenticeship's worth of knowledge in their hands. These are the men who form the backbone of the Sons of Liberty, respectable, propertied, and increasingly furious. Women work every bit as hard, though the account books rarely say so. A good wife runs the household like a small business, which it is. She cooks, brews, preserves, sews, spins, cleans, manages the children, and often keeps the shop or the finances besides. In a boycott, she's the one who decides whether the family buys British cloth or spins its own, which means the entire economic weapon of the resistance runs straight through her spinning wheel. Underestimate her at your peril, Britain certainly did. And looming over all of it is the simple, maddening truth that no matter how hard you work, how clever your trades, how careful your ledgers, a parliament an ocean away can rewrite the rules whenever it pleases. A new tax, a new regulation, a new restriction on where you can sell and to whom, and suddenly all your labour is worth a little less. You didn't vote for these rules. You weren't asked. You simply wake up one morning and find the terms of your entire livelihood have changed, decided by men who wouldn't recognise you if you served them dinner. So you work, and you save, and you grumble, and you watch the harbour. Because in Boston, your living comes from the sea, but your grievances come from London, and the two are about to collide in the coldest, wettest way imaginable. Let's talk money, or the frustrating lack of it. Your pockets jingle with a bewildering mix of British pounds, Spanish dollars, and colonial paper notes that everyone eyes with suspicion. Actual coins are so scarce you'd think they were enchanted, and every time you finally scrape together a little profit, along comes a fresh tax from London to gently relieve you of it. You are technically a proud subject of the most powerful empire on earth. You're also broke, taxed, and increasingly convinced that the empire views you less as a citizen and more as a coin-operated machine. And that resentment? Oh, it's been building. Let's rewind a few years to see where the anger really began. The first thing to understand is that hard money, actual metal coins, is maddeningly rare in the colonies. Britain, in its infinite wisdom, prefers that gold and silver flow toward London, not away from it, so it never bothered to mint a proper colonial currency. The result is a chaotic grab bag of coinage from all over the world. Spanish silver dollars, minted from the silver of the Americas, are so common they're practically the local standard, and people literally cut them into pieces to make change. 8 pieces, in fact, which is where pieces of 8 comes from. Your money is, quite literally, chopped up. To fill the gap, the colonies print paper money, and paper money is only ever as trustworthy as the people printing it. Its value wobbles, it inflates. A note that's worth a good deal in one colony may be viewed with deep suspicion in the next. You learn to do rapid mental math converting between currencies just to buy a loaf of bread, and you develop strong opinions about which paper you'll accept and which you'll politely decline while backing slowly toward the door. Now layer the taxes on top of this already precarious system. Every levy from London has to be paid, ideally in the very hard currency that's already impossible to find. So not only are you being taxed, you're being taxed in a form of money the empire has ensured you barely have. It's a bit like being fined, and then discovering the fine can only be paid in a gift card for a store that doesn't exist in your country. The frustration isn't just about the amount, it's about the sheer grinding impracticality of it. And the complaints, oh, the complaints. Bostonians have elevated grumbling about money to something close to an art form. In the taverns, in the markets, on the wharves, the talk circles endlessly back to costs, debts, taxes, and the outrageous prices of British goods. Everyone has a story about being squeezed. Everyone knows someone ruined by a bad shipment or a sudden levy. Complaining is free, which in Boston makes it the most affordable entertainment available. But underneath the everyday griping runs something deeper and colder. It's the slow dawning realization that the money problem isn't an accident. It's the system working exactly as designed. The colonies exist in London's eyes to generate wealth that flows back to the mother country. You're a source of raw materials and a market for finished goods, and the whole machine is arranged so that the profit ends up on the far side of the ocean. You're not a partner in the empire, you're a revenue stream wearing a powdered wig. Once you see it that way, the taxes stop feeling like isolated annoyances and start feeling like proof of something. Every new levy confirms the suspicion that London simply reaches across the sea and takes, whenever the royal accounts run short, without asking, without limit, and without the slightest interest in what you think about it. That's the resentment that's been quietly compounding, like a debt, for years now. So let's rewind and watch the first big spark land, back in 1765, when Britain found a way to tax the very paper this story's printed on. Before we get to the shouting, let's understand your relationship with Britain, because it's complicated, like most relationships that end in someone throwing property into a harbour. For most of your life, you've considered yourself thoroughly, patriotically British. You drink to the King's health, you fight in Britain's wars, you buy British goods, and feel rather sophisticated doing it. Britain is the mother country, and you are the loyal, if slightly neglected child across the ocean. The trouble is, Mother has recently run up an enormous war debt, and she has decided that you, dear colonies, are going to help pay it off. Whether you agree to this arrangement is apparently not part of the conversation. For generations, the arrangement worked well enough, mostly because Britain wasn't paying very close attention. Historians would later give it a wonderfully honest name, salutary neglect. The colonies were left largely to govern themselves, to run their own assemblies, pass their own local laws, and manage their own affairs so long as the trade kept flowing and the profits kept sailing home. It was a hands-off parenting style, and like most children left to their own devices, the colonies grew up more independent than anyone quite noticed at the time. You genuinely admired Britain. Its constitution was, to your mind, the envy of the world, a system that protected the rights of freeborn Englishmen against the tyranny of kings. You believed yourself the inheritor of those rights, every bit as much as a man born in London. That belief matters enormously, because it means that when Britain later starts treating you as something less than a full Englishman, the insult cuts far deeper than any tax. It isn't just money, it's a betrayal of who you thought you were. Then came the Great War, the one you call the French and Indian War, and Europe calls the 7 Years' War. Britain and its colonies fought France for control of the continent, and it was long, brutal, and staggeringly expensive. Colonists fought and bled in that war alongside British regulars, which only deepened your sense of shared identity and shared sacrifice. When it ended in victory, France was pushed off the map of North America, and you felt, quite reasonably, like a proud and loyal part of a triumphant empire. But victory, it turns out, has a bill attached, and the bill was enormous. Britain emerged from the war saddled with a mountain of debt and a vast new territory to defend. Someone had to pay for the soldiers still stationed in America, for the administration, for the whole costly apparatus of empire. And from London's comfortable perspective, the answer was obvious. The war had been fought partly to protect the colonies, so surely the colonies should help shoulder the cost. It seemed only fair to London. From your side of the ocean, though, it looked rather different. You'd already contributed men and money and blood to that war. You'd governed yourselves competently for over a century. And now, suddenly, the mother country wanted not just trade and loyalty, but a direct hand in your pockets, enforced by a parliament in which you had no voice whatsoever. The neglect that had defined your whole relationship was ending, and it was being replaced by something that felt a lot like control. This is the moment the relationship begins to sour, quietly at first, then all at once. The child has grown up. The mother has decided to start giving order again, as though nothing has changed, as though the past 100 years never happened. And the tragedy, the real tragedy, is that for a long while you don't want to break away at all. You just want to be treated as what you believe you are, a full and equal Englishman, entitled to the same rights as anyone in London. All Britain has to do is agree. Spoiler, Britain does not agree. Let's rewind to 1765, the year Britain discovered a spectacular new way to annoy you. It was called the Stamp Act, and it slapped a tax on basically anything made of paper. Newspapers, legal documents, licenses, even playing cards. Yes, they came for your card games. The genius of it was that it made almost everyone furious at once, from lawyers to printers to the tavern crowd who simply wanted to lose money at cards in peace. The colonies erupted. There were protests, effigies, boycotts, and enough outrage that Britain eventually backed down and repealed it. You celebrated. You thought you'd won. Oh, you sweet summer colonist. You had merely poked the bear and taught it to file paperwork. Here's why the Stamp Act stung so precisely. It was the first time Britain had reached directly into the colonies to tax the people themselves, rather than simply regulating trade at the ports. Earlier duties had been about commerce, buried in the price of imported goods. This was different. This was a tax you could see and feel stamped right onto the everyday paper of your life. Every legal contract, every newspaper, every deck of cards, every diploma had to bear a purchase stamp, or it wasn't valid. It touched everyone, everywhere, all at once, and it hit the two groups you least want angry in a society, the people who write and the people who argue for a living. Printers, whose entire trade was paper, were outraged, and printers happened to control the newspapers. Lawyers, whose every document now required a stamp, were outraged, and lawyers happened to be very good at making a persuasive, extremely loud case. Britain had, with remarkable efficiency, infuriated precisely the people best equipped to whip up a colony-wide fury. It was less a policy and more an act of self-sabotage. The response was ferocious and creative. Mobs took to the streets. Effigies of tax officials were hung from trees, paraded through town and cheerfully burned. The appointed stamp distributors found their homes surrounded, their windows smashed, and their courage rapidly evaporating, most resigned before they'd stamped a single sheet. A great elm in Boston became known as the Liberty Tree, a gathering place for protest, and it would remain a symbol of resistance for years. The message was blunt. There would be no one left willing to enforce this tax because enforcing it had become genuinely dangerous. It was during the Stamp Act crisis that the rallying cry first rang out clearly: no taxation without representation. Colonial leaders gathered in a Stamp Act Congress, the first time representatives from multiple colonies met to coordinate a unified response, which was itself a quietly revolutionary act. They argued, respectfully but firmly, that Englishmen could only be taxed by their own elected representatives, and since the colonies elected no one to Parliament, Parliament had no right to tax them directly. It was a legal argument, a constitutional argument, and it was about to become an unstoppable one. Faced with riots, boycotts, and a sharp drop in trade that hurt British merchants back home, Parliament grumbled and repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. The colonies celebrated wildly, ringing bells, lighting bonfires, and toasting the king as though he had personally handed them their liberty. For a shining moment, it felt like a total victory. The system had worked. You'd protested, and the mighty empire had listened. But you missed the fine print, because Britain, sore loser that it was, repealed the tax with one hand and passed the Declaratory Act with the other. This quiet, ominous little law stated that Parliament had full authority to make laws binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever. In other words, we're taking back the tax, but make no mistake, we absolutely still have the right to do this whenever we like. You'd won the battle and completely failed to notice that Britain had just reserved the right to keep fighting the war. The bear was awake now, and it was taking notes. Just as the dust settled, Britain returned with a fresh idea, because apparently learning lessons is for other empires. In 1767 came the Townshend Acts, taxing everyday imported goods like glass, paper, paint, lead, and crucially tea. The logic was that these were smaller, sneakier taxes, tucked into the price of things you buy anyway, so surely you wouldn't make a fuss. Reader, you made a fuss. Because it was never truly about the size of the tax. A few pennies here and there wasn't going to bankrupt you. It was the principle of the thing, the maddening idea that a parliament thousands of miles away could reach across the ocean and decide what came out of your pocket whenever it pleased, forever. The man behind them was Charles Townshend, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, a clever fellow who thought he'd found a loophole in colonial anger. The colonists, he reasoned, had objected to internal taxes levied directly inside the colonies, like the Stamp Act. So he'd give them external taxes instead, duties collected at the ports on imported goods. Same money, different doorway. He was quite pleased with himself. He had completely misunderstood what the colonists were actually angry about, which is a mistake British officials would make with remarkable consistency right up until the shooting started. Because the colonists weren't drawing a fine legal line between internal and external taxes. They were drawing a line under a single word: consent. It didn't matter whether the tax was collected at your door or at the dock. What mattered was that you hadn't agreed to it, and had no representative who could. Townshend's clever distinction crumbled the moment it met the actual grievance. You might as well have argued about whether you were being robbed through the front window or the back one. Either way, someone's climbing into your house. The Townshend Acts came with teeth too. To enforce them, Britain expanded the customs service and created new courts and officials to hunt down smugglers, of whom Boston had a great and proud many. Worse, they introduced writs of assistance, general search warrants that let officials rummage through your warehouse, your ship, or your home looking for untaxed goods. without needing to specify what they were searching for or why. To a people who prized the sanctity of their property, this felt like tyranny with a clipboard. Your home was supposed to be your castle. Now the crown had a master key. So the colonies dusted off their favourite weapon, the boycott. Non-importation agreements spread from town to town, with merchants pledging to stop importing British goods entirely. It was economic warfare, and it was surprisingly effective, because the colonies were an enormous market, and British merchants felt the loss keenly. Homespun cloth became a badge of patriotism. Drinking smuggled Dutch tea instead of taxed British tea became a small daily act of defiance. Women organised as the Daughters of Liberty, spinning their own thread and brewing herbal substitutes, turning the household itself into a front line of the resistance. John Dickinson, a Pennsylvania lawyer, laid out the colonial case in a series of widely read essays called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. Calmly, reasonably, and devastatingly, he argued that Parliament had no right to tax the colonies for the purpose of raising revenue, no matter how the tax was dressed up. The essays were reprinted in newspapers everywhere and helped turn scattered anger into a coherent, shared argument. This was the printed word doing exactly what Britain most feared, organising the outrage. Under pressure, Parliament eventually backed down again, repealing most of the Townshend duties in 1770. But, in a move that should feel eerily familiar by now, it kept one. It kept the tax on tea. Not because the money mattered much, but as a matter of principle, a deliberate reminder that Parliament still claimed the right to tax you. Britain simply could not resist leaving one small thorn in place, just to prove it could. That thorn was tea, and that thorn, dear listener, is the one this entire story is about to snag on. Here's the phrase that would echo through history and eventually onto 1,000 school posters: no taxation without representation. Let's unpack it, because it's the beating heart of this whole mess. The problem wasn't just that you were being taxed, it was that you had absolutely no one speaking for you in the Parliament doing the taxing. Not a single seat, not a single vote, not one representative who could stand up and say, "Hang on, the people of Boston might have thoughts about this." You were expected to pay without a voice, to obey without a say. It's the 18th century equivalent of being charged a mystery fee, calling customer service, and discovering there is no phone number and never was. To understand why this drove colonists to genuine fury, you have to understand what they believed about their own rights. Every freeborn Englishman they held possessed certain ancient liberties, going all the way back to Magna Carta. Chief among them was the idea that a man could not be taxed except by his own consent, given through representatives he himself had elected. This wasn't a radical new theory the colonists invented. It was, they argued, the very foundation of English liberty, the thing that separated a free Englishman from a subject of some grubby tyrant on the continent. The colonies took this principle seriously because they lived it. Each colony had its own elected assembly, a little local parliament where propertied men chose representatives to vote on laws, and crucially, taxes. When your own assembly taxed you, that was legitimate, because you'd had a hand in choosing the men who did it. You could vote them out if they overreached. You had, in other words, consent and recourse. That was the whole point. That was self-government, and the colonists had been practicing it for over a century. Now compare that to Parliament in London. Not one single member of that body was elected by a colonist. Not one owed his seat to a vote cast in Boston or Virginia or Philadelphia. When Parliament taxed the colonies, it was taxing people who had no way to elect its members, no way to influence its decisions, and no way to remove anyone who wronged them. From the colonial view, this wasn't taxation at all. It was simply confiscation with extra steps and better handwriting. Britain had a counter-argument, and it's worth hearing, because it reveals just how differently the two sides saw the world. British officials claim the colonies enjoyed something called virtual representation. The idea was that every member of Parliament represented the interests of all British subjects everywhere, whether they'd voted for him or not. A member sitting for some tiny English town supposedly also represented the merchant in Boston and the farmer in Georgia in spirit, by looking out for the general good of the empire. Your interests were being considered, London insisted, just not by anyone you'd chosen or could reach. The colonists found this argument somewhere between insulting and hilarious. Virtual representation, they scoffed, was no representation at all. A man in London who had never seen America would never visit. An answer to voters with entirely different interests could hardly be trusted to safeguard your rights when they conflicted with his own constituents. It was representation in the way a portrait is a person, a flattering resemblance with none of the substance. You couldn't vote for it, argue with it, or hold it accountable. It was a comforting fiction designed to make you feel represented while ensuring you never actually were. And so, the slogan crystallized everything. No taxation without representation. 5 words that captured a constitutional principle, a personal grievance, and a rising demand all at once. It was reasonable, it was moderate. In its earliest form, it wasn't even a call for independence, just a demand to be treated as the equal Englishmen the colonists believed themselves to be. But buried inside that reasonable phrase was a radical seed. Because if Britain would not grant representation and would not stop taxing, then eventually the only way to secure your rights would be to stop being British altogether. Nobody was ready to say that out loud yet, but the logic was already there, waiting, patient as a lit fuse. So how does an ocean-wide temper tantrum actually organise itself? With ink. Boston is a town swimming in newspapers, pamphlets and broadsheets nailed to tavern doors, and the printers are working overtime. Writers like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson fill column after column with fiery arguments about liberty, rights and tyranny, and people gather to read them aloud in taverns for the many who can't read themselves. This is your social media, except slower, inkier, and far more likely to give you a paper cut than a like. Word travels not at the speed of light, but at the speed of a very determined man on a very tired horse, and somehow that turns out to be fast enough to change the world. The printing press was the great engine of the resistance, and the colonies were extraordinarily well supplied with them. Boston alone had several competing newspapers, and towns throughout the colonies had their own. A single well-written essay could be set in type, printed, and then reprinted by papers up and down the coast, carried by ship and rider until an argument first made in a Boston back room was being debated in a Charleston tavern weeks later. It was a slow-motion network, but it was a network, and it stitched the scattered colonies into something that could think and act together. Samuel Adams was the master of this dark art. Where his cousin John Adams was a careful lawyer, Samuel was a propagandist of genius, a man who understood that facts were useful but feelings were powerful. He wrote tirelessly under a rotating cast of pen names, flooding the papers with essays that made every British action sound like a deliberate step toward enslaving the colonies. Was he always scrupulously fair? He was not. Was he devastatingly effective? Absolutely. He could take a minor customs dispute and, with the right words, transform it into a chilling omen of tyranny. He was, in modern terms, extremely good at going viral. The pamphlet was the heavier artillery. Where a newspaper essay was a quick jab, a pamphlet was a sustained argument, cheap to produce and easy to pass hand to hand. Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer spread this way, as would countless other works in the years to come. A good pamphlet could be read in an evening, shared with a neighbour and argued over for weeks. They gave the resistance not just slogans but reasoning, a whole intellectual scaffolding that let ordinary colonists explain exactly why they were angry and why they were right. But here's the part that's easy to forget. Most people couldn't read especially well, and many couldn't read at all. So the printed word did its most important work out loud. In the taverns, someone literate would read the latest essay or news aloud to a crowd gathered over their ale, and the debate would erupt from there. The tavern was the true town square, the place where print became speech and speech became consensus. Information didn't just get distributed, it got discussed, chewed over, and hammered into shared conviction pint by pint. The Sons of Liberty understood the power of all this perfectly and used it relentlessly. They didn't just protest, they publicised. They staged their demonstrations with an eye to how they'd be described in the papers afterward. They coined phrases, spread stories, and made sure that every British misstep was reported in the most damning possible light. They grasped a truth that every movement since has relied upon. It isn't enough for an event to happen. People have to hear about it, and they have to hear about it your way first. The crowning example was still to come, but its method was already clear. When British soldiers fired on a Boston crowd, Paul Revere would produce an engraving of the scene so dramatic and so slanted that it seared itself into colonial memory, facts be slightly damned. That single image would do more to inflame the colonies than any number of dry legal arguments. It was the printed word as a weapon, aimed and fired with deadly precision. So while it's tempting to picture the revolution as a thing of muskets and battlefields, remember that long before the first shot, the war was fought in ink. The presses ran hot, the riders rode hard, and the taverns roared, and out of all that paper and noise a scattered collection of grumbling colonies slowly, steadily began to think of itself as one people with one cause. The tea was still coming, but by the time it arrived, the words had already done their work. Every good rebellion needs a group of guys with a dramatic name and questionable meeting habits. And Boston has the Sons of Liberty. Part protest movement, part secret society, part neighbourhood watch with a grudge. They organise the boycotts, stage the demonstrations, and generally make life inconvenient for anyone loyal to the crown. Their ranks include silversmith Paul Revere, the fiery Samuel Adams, and the wealthy merchant John Hancock, whose signature you'll one day recognise immediately. They meet in taverns, under trees, and in the back rooms of print shops, plotting resistance over ale. It's a bit like a book club. If the book were forbidden, the club were illegal, and the ending involved tea sinking to the bottom of a harbour. The name itself was a gift, and an accidental one. During the Stamp Act debates, a member of Parliament who actually sympathised with the colonies referred to the American protesters as Sons of Liberty in a speech. The colonists loved it, seized it, and made it their own. There's a particular satisfaction in taking a phrase spoken in the halls of your oppressor and turning it into your battle standard, and the Sons wore it proudly. Nothing annoys an empire quite like being quoted back to itself. They were not, it must be said, a single tidy organisation with a headquarters and a membership card. They were a loose, sprawling web of local groups scattered across the colonies, connected by correspondence and shared purpose, rather than any formal structure. This was actually their strength. There was no single leader to arrest, no one office to raid, no tidy list of names to round up. Cut off one group, and another kept working. They were less an army and more a rumour that occasionally set things on fire. Their membership crossed the usual social lines in ways that made them genuinely dangerous. At the top were respectable, propertied men, merchants like Hancock, lawyers, and skilled artisans like Revere, men with reputations and resources to lend the cause legitimacy. But they also drew on the muscle of the docks and the streets. the sailors, labourers and apprentices who could turn out a crowd on short notice and make that crowd very persuasive. This alliance of the respectable and the rowdy meant the sons could argue eloquently in the newspapers one day and surround a tax official's house the next. Their tactics ran the full range from clever to menacing. They organised boycotts and enforced them, publicly shaming any merchant who dared keep importing British goods, printing his name in the papers as a traitor to the cause. They staged elaborate public demonstrations around their Liberty Tree, that great elm in Boston that became a shrine to resistance. And when persuasion failed, they were not above intimidation. A smashed window here, a coat of tar and feathers there, a mob assembled outside the right door at the right hour. It was activism with an implied threat, and the implication was rarely subtle. The tar and feathers deserve a special mention because they were as brutal as they were theatrical. A hated official would be seized, stripped, coated in hot tar, and rolled in feathers, then paraded through town as a humiliated, blistered spectacle. It was agonizing, degrading, and occasionally life-threatening, and it sent an unmistakable message to anyone thinking of enforcing the Crown's will. Nothing on a modern city council quite compares, and we should all be grateful for that. What made the Sons of Liberty truly effective, though, was organisation married to communication. Through committees of correspondence, they kept the various colonies informed of every development, every outrage, every act of resistance. They ensured that an insult to Boston was felt in Virginia, that a victory in one town encouraged a dozen others. They were building, quietly and deliberately, the connective tissue of a future nation. And when the moment came to do something truly audacious in the harbour, it was these men, and the networks they'd spent years weaving, who would make it happen with terrifying precision. Now, if Britain won't stop taxing your goods, you have two proud options. Stop buying them, or buy them anyway, and simply forget to pay the tax. Bostonians embraced both with enthusiasm. Boycotts became a patriotic sport, with colonists proudly draping themselves in scratchy homemade cloth, rather than fashionable British imports. Meanwhile, smuggling became a booming wink-wink industry, and merchants like John Hancock grew rich moving goods past the tax collectors. To Britain, he was a criminal. To Boston, he was a hero with excellent timing. It's the age-old truth that one person's smuggler is another person's freedom-loving small businessman who simply prefers not to fund an empire that keeps ignoring his letters. Let's start with the boycotts, because they were the respectable face of resistance. Through non-importation agreements, colonial merchants collectively pledged to stop bringing in British goods, and the whole community was expected to back them up by refusing to buy. This turned shopping into a political act. Draping yourself in fine British cloth suddenly marked you as suspect, while wearing rough, homemade homespun became a badge of honour. Fashion and patriotism became tangled together, and for once the least comfortable outfit in the room was also the most virtuous. The genius of the boycott was that it put the entire economic weight of the colonies behind the cause without a single shot fired. The colonies were a massive market for British manufactured goods, and when that market slammed shut, British merchants and manufacturers felt the pain immediately. Those merchants then turned around and pressured their own government to back down, which is precisely how the Stamp Act and most of the Townshend duties were eventually repealed. It was in effect colonists discovering that the wallet could be mightier than the musket. Women were the true backbone of this weapon, though the history books often forget to say so. Organised as the Daughters of Liberty, they took on the enormous labour of replacing boycotted British goods with domestic ones. They held spinning bees, gathering to spin thread and weave cloth so families wouldn't need imported fabric. They brewed herbal teas from local plants as substitutes for the taxed British leaf. Every skein of homespun and every cup of raspberry leaf tea was a small blow against the empire delivered from the hearth. The resistance ran straight through the household economy, and women controlled that economy. Now for the smuggling, which was the far less respectable but equally patriotic cousin of the boycott. The truth is that the colonies had been smuggling for decades before anyone dressed it up as a political principle. Britain's trade laws funneled colonial commerce through British hands and British ports, and colonists had long simply gone around them, trading directly with the Dutch, the French, and anyone else offering a better price. Smuggling wasn't a fringe activity. It was practically the backbone of New England's economy, an open secret everyone participated in and nobody discussed at customs. Enter John Hancock, one of the wealthiest men in Boston and a smuggler of considerable renown. Hancock had inherited a vast merchant fortune, and a good deal of his business involved moving goods past the tax collectors with a smile and a shrug. When British customs officials seized his ship, the Liberty, on smuggling suspicions in 1768, it sparked riots in Boston. Rather than ruining him, the persecution made him a martyr and a hero, a rich man being hounded by the crown for the same thing half the harbour was doing. It was excellent publicity, and Hancock, no fool, leaned into it. This is the delicious irony at the heart of the tea crisis to come. The colonists weren't objecting to tea because they couldn't get it. They could get all the tea they wanted cheaply from Dutch smugglers, tax-free and untroubled. What they objected to was being forced to buy the taxed British version, and thereby admit Parliament's right to tax them at all. Their resistance was funded in part by men who profited handsomely from the illegal alternative. Principal and profit marched arm in arm toward the harbour, and honestly they made a very effective team. Let's talk about the night things turned bloody, because tempers this hot were always going to spark. It's 1770, a cold March evening, and a crowd of Bostonians is heckling a lone British soldier outside the customs house. More soldiers arrive. The crowd swells, hurling insults, snowballs and chunks of ice. Then, in a burst of panic and confusion, the soldiers fire. When the smoke clears, 5 colonists are dead. It's chaos, tragedy, and a public relations catastrophe for Britain all at once. Paul Revere quickly produces a dramatic engraving, and just like that, 5 dead men become a rallying cry. The cobblestones have been stained, and trust between Boston and its soldiers is now well and truly broken. To understand how it happened, you have to feel the pressure that had been building. British troops had been stationed in Boston since 1768, and by now the town and the soldiers thoroughly loathed each other. The Redcoats were a daily provocation, a standing insult, and worse, they competed with locals for scarce part-time work in their off-duty hours, which meant they were resented as job stealers on top of everything else. Every day brought fresh friction, shoving matches, shouted insults, brawls in the streets. The whole town was a bundle of frayed nerves in a redcoat's shadow. On the night of March 5th, it began with something small, as these things do. A young apprentice was heckling a British officer over an unpaid bill, and a lone sentry standing guard struck the boy across the head with his musket. Word spread, a crowd gathered, and it grew ugly fast. Church bells rang, which normally signalled a fire and brought people running into the streets, so the crowd swelled even further. The lone sentry, now genuinely frightened, called for help, and a small squad of soldiers pushed through the mob to reach him. Picture the scene. A knot of nervous, outnumbered soldiers, muskets loaded, backed against a wall by a jeering, jostling crowd in the freezing dark. The colonists pelted them with snowballs, ice, oyster shells and sticks, daring them to fire, taunting that they wouldn't dare. It was a powder keg with a short fuse, and someone was always going to drop a match. Exactly what happened next is disputed to this day. A soldier was likely knocked down, a shout of fire went up from somewhere, and in the confusion, the soldiers began shooting into the crowd. When it was over, 3 colonists lay dead in the snow and 2 more would die of their wounds. Among the dead was Crispus Attucks, a man of African and Native American descent, often remembered as the first to fall in the cause of American liberty. 5 men, killed on a Boston street by British soldiers. Whatever the murky truth of who provoked whom, the raw fact was undeniable and devastating. The Crown's troops had fired on the Crown's own subjects. There was no coming back from that. The propaganda machine went to work immediately, and Samuel Adams and Paul Revere were its master operators. Revere produced a now famous engraving depicting the scene as a cold-blooded slaughter, an orderly line of grinning soldiers firing on peaceful, defenceless citizens on the command of their officer. It was, to put it gently, not an accurate representation of a chaotic mob pelting frightened men with the ice. But accuracy was never the point. The image was designed to enrage, and enrage it did, spreading through the colonies and searing the Boston Massacre into the public mind forever. Here's the twist that history loves. The soldiers were put on trial, and their defense attorney was none other than John Adams, future patriot and future president. Adams, believing fiercely that even hated men deserved a fair trial, defended the soldiers and won acquittals for most of them, arguing they'd acted in genuine fear for their lives. It was a remarkable act of principle in a town howling for blood, and it revealed the colonists' deep, sincere commitment to the rule of law even against their own passions. But that legal nuance faded quickly. What endured was the engraving, the outrage, and the martyrs. The blood on those cobblestones would not wash away, and Boston would not forget. Imagine, if you will, that your least favourite co-workers moved into your neighbourhood, armed, and were legally allowed to stay. That's daily life with British troops stationed in Boston. They patrol your streets, compete with locals for scarce jobs in their off hours, and serve as a permanent red-coated reminder that London does not trust you one bit. Every glance is tense, every tavern argument one insult away from a brawl. You can't walk to the market without passing a soldier who represents everything you've come to resent. It's less an occupation of soldiers and more an occupation of the mood. A low, constant hum of hostility that makes the whole town feel like a kettle slowly, quietly beginning to whistle. The troops had arrived in 1768, sent to restore order after the unrest over the Townshend Acts, and their very presence was an insult wrapped in a threat. Boston was not a conquered city. It was a British town full of British subjects, and yet here were British regiments stationed in its heart as though it were enemy territory. The message could not have been clearer or more offensive. London no longer trusted you to govern yourselves, and had sent armed men to remind you who was in charge. The physical presence of the army was inescapable. Soldiers drilled on the common that shared green space, filling it with the sights and sounds of military occupation. Sentries stood at posts throughout the town. The rattle of drums marked the rhythms of the garrison's day, an unwanted soundtrack to your morning. Redcoats were simply everywhere, a constant scarlet stain across the familiar streets, and there was no getting away from them. You woke to them, you passed them on your errands, and you went to sleep knowing they were still out there in the dark. Then there was the matter of housing them, which grated more than almost anything. Under the Quartering Act, the colonies were expected to help house and supply the very troops sent to control them. This was a special kind of insult, being made to pay for your own occupation, to fund the boot on your own neck. Bostonians resisted it fiercely. refusing to provide accommodation and forcing the army into tents, warehouses and public buildings. But the principle stung. The crown could not only station soldiers among you, it could make you cover the bill. The economic friction was quieter but constant. British soldiers were poorly paid, and many sought part-time work in their off-duty hours to make ends meet. In a town where labour was already scarce and seasonal, this pitted redcoats directly against local dock workers and labourers for the same scraps of work, often for lower wages. Every job a soldier took was a job a Bostonian didn't get, and that resentment simmered on the wharves and in the workshops, occasionally boiling over into the brawls that had helped spark the massacre itself. Socially, the whole arrangement was a slow poison. The soldiers and the townspeople existed in a state of mutual contempt, trading insults, shoves and challenges. To the colonists, the redcoats were arrogant tools of tyranny. To the soldiers, the colonists were ungrateful, treasonous rabble who mocked them at every turn. Neither side was entirely wrong, which is exactly what made it so combustible. Familiarity didn't breed peace. It bred 1,000 small grievances, each one remembered, each one adding to the pile. And that, ultimately, is the corrosive genius of a military occupation, even a relatively restrained one. It doesn't need a massacre every week to do its work. It just needs to be there, day after day, a permanent presence that says you are not free, you're not trusted, and you are being watched. It turns ordinary streets into a stage for confrontation, and ordinary citizens into resentful subjects. By 1773, Boston had been living under this hostile hum for years, and the town had learned a hard, dangerous lesson. The Empire would answer defiance not with dialogue but with soldiers. That knowledge would shape everything about how the night in the harbour was planned. Now, you might reasonably ask, of all the things to start a revolution over, why tea? Let me explain. Tea isn't just a drink in the colonies. It's a ritual, a comfort, a social glue. Everyone drinks it, rich and poor, morning and night. It's the 18th century equivalent of your daily coffee, except more genteel and consumed while judging your neighbours. So when the tax lands squarely on tea, it lands on something in nearly every household in America. That's what makes it so dangerous. Britain didn't tax a luxury few people cared about. It taxed the one small daily pleasure that connected the entire colonial world, and in doing so, it turned every kitchen table into a tiny battlefield. Tea had swept through the British world over the previous century and conquered it utterly. What began as an exotic and expensive novelty from Asia had become, by the 1700s, an everyday staple. The colonists drank enormous quantities of it, likely more per person than the English themselves. It was woven into the fabric of daily life so thoroughly that a day without tea was scarcely a day at all. This was not some rare indulgence for the wealthy. This was the beverage of the entire society, top to bottom. Part of tea's power was social. To take tea was to perform a whole small ceremony, and that ceremony carried meaning. The tea table was where women in particular held court, where visits were received, where news and gossip were exchanged, where respectability was displayed through fine cups and correct manners. A family's tea service was a statement of its status and taste. To sit down to tea was to participate in a shared ritual that spanned the entire English-speaking world, a comforting sense of belonging to something larger and more refined than your muddy little street. This is precisely why taxing it was such a masterstroke of self-sabotage on Britain's part. A tax on some obscure luxury would have annoyed a handful of wealthy merchants and passed unnoticed by everyone else. But a tax on tea reached into every home in the colonies, from the grandest merchant's parlour to the humblest labourer's kitchen. Suddenly the empire's grasping hand was visible at your own table every single day in the very cup you lifted to your lips. It was a daily, intimate, unavoidable reminder of a grievance you might otherwise have managed to forget between crises. And so tea became something it had never been meant to be, a political test. To drink taxed British tea was to quietly accept Parliament's right to tax you. To refuse it was to take a stand. This is why the boycotts hit tea so hard, and why patriotic households switched to smuggled Dutch tea or brewed substitutes from local herbs, calling them Liberty tea with no small amount of pride. A simple cup of tea had become a declaration of loyalty, one way or the other, poured out fresh every morning. The substitutes, it should be said, were not universally beloved. Colonists brewed all manner of things in tea's place: raspberry leaf, sassafras, mint, various flowers and herbs, whatever could be steeped and swallowed with a straight face. Some were tolerable. Many were, by honest accounts, fairly grim. But choking down a mug of bitter herbal brew became a point of patriotic honour, proof that you'd sacrifice even your morning comfort for the cause. There is something quietly heroic and quietly hilarious about a revolution partly fueled by people bravely drinking bad tea on principle. So when the story reaches its famous climax and all that tea goes into the harbour, understand that it wasn't just cargo being destroyed. It was the single most beloved everyday commodity in the colonies, the very substance of daily comfort and social life, being deliberately, righteously ruined. That's what gave the act its shocking power. These weren't people smashing something they didn't care about. They were destroying something they loved, precisely to prove how much they loved something else more. Liberty, it turned out, tasted better than tea, which was convenient given how bad the substitutes were. To understand why the tea showed up when it did, meet the British East India Company, a corporate behemoth so large it had its own army, and so mismanaged it was drowning in debt. This company practically was the British economy in Asia, and it was sitting on mountains of unsold tea rotting in warehouses. Rather than let this too-big-to-fail giant collapse, Parliament cooked up a plan to rescue it by dumping all that surplus tea onto the colonial market. So the tea crisis wasn't only about taxes, it was also about a struggling mega-corporation getting a government bailout, paid for, as always, by squeezing the people at the very bottom. Some things, it turns out, are truly timeless. The East India Company was unlike any business that had ever existed. Chartered back in 1600, it had grown over the generations from a simple trading venture into something genuinely monstrous in scale. It didn't merely trade with Asia, it ruled swaths of it. It commanded its own private armies, larger than those of many actual nations. It collected taxes, waged wars, and administered territory across the Indian subcontinent. It was a corporation that had swallowed an empire, a business entity wielding the powers of a state, answerable in theory to shareholders and in practice to almost no one. You would think an enterprise that vast and powerful would be swimming in profit, and for a time it was. But by the early 1770s, the company was a catastrophe. Corruption was rampant, its officials growing obscenely rich while the company itself hemorrhaged money. A devastating famine in Bengal had wrecked its revenues. Overextension, mismanagement and speculation had left the whole colossus teetering on the edge of collapse. The giant, it turned out, had feet of very expensive clay. And here was the problem that made everyone in London sit up. The East India Company was too big to fail. Its collapse would have sent shockwaves through the entire British economy, ruining countless investors, including many powerful members of Parliament who held its stock. The company's debts and its fortunes were tangled up with the government's own credit. If it went down, It might drag a good deal of Britain's financial establishment down with it. Something had to be done, and quickly, and preferably in a way that protected the men who mattered. One of the company's many problems was tea, specifically that it was sitting on a colossal surplus of the stuff. Something like £17 million of tea languished in its London warehouses, unsold and slowly losing value. The company desperately needed to convert that mountain of leaves into cash. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the colonial market was being supplied largely by Dutch smugglers, cheaper and untaxed, cutting the company out of a market that should have been its own. The solution seemed obvious to the men drawing it up. Find a way to flush all that surplus tea into America. This is the crucial thing to grasp about the crisis to come. The Tea Act that would light the fuse wasn't primarily a scheme to raise revenue by taxing colonists. It was, first and foremost, a corporate rescue package. It was designed to save the East India Company by giving it a privileged direct route into the colonial market, undercutting the smugglers and unloading that warehouse of tea. The tax on tea was kept in place, yes, but the driving purpose was bailing out a failing corporate giant whose collapse the political class could not afford. And that's what gave the whole affair its extra sting of injustice once colonists understood it. It wasn't just that they were being taxed without consent. It was that they were being manoeuvred, their market rigged, their principles trampled, all to prop up a bloated, corrupt, mismanaged corporation whose powerful friends in Parliament refused to let it face the consequences of its own greed. Ordinary colonists were being asked to swallow both a tax and a monopoly, so that distant investors wouldn't lose their shirts. Framed that way, it's remarkable the tea made it as far as the harbour at all. And so we arrive at the spark itself, the Tea Act of 1773. On paper, it looked almost generous. It let the East India Company sell tea directly to the colonies, cutting out middlemen and actually lowering the price. Cheaper tea, everybody wins, right? Wrong. Because the hated tax stayed firmly in place, which meant that buying this bargain tea was the same as admitting Britain had every right to tax you whenever it liked. It was a trap dressed up as a discount, a beautifully wrapped gift with a live snake inside. Britain assumed you'd happily take the cheap tea and swallow your principles along with it. Britain, as it happens, had badly misjudged the room. Let's walk through the mechanics, because the cleverness of the scheme is what made it so infuriating. Normally, East India Company tea travelled a long, taxed, expensive road, shipped to London, sold at auction to British middlemen, then shipped again to colonial merchants, with duties and markups accumulating at every step. The Tea Act cut out that entire chain. Now the company could ship its tea directly to its own chosen agents in the colonies and sell it straight to consumers, skipping the middlemen and their markups entirely. The effect on price was dramatic. Stripped of all those layers of cost, the company's tea could be sold in the colonies more cheaply than ever before, cheaper even than the smuggled Dutch tea that had captured so much of the market. On the surface, this looked like a wonderful deal for the colonial consumer. Your favourite beverage, now at a discount courtesy of Parliament. What kind of ungrateful malcontent could possibly object to cheaper tea? The kind who reads the fine print, that's who. Because tucked inside this bargain was the Townshend duty on tea, the one tax Parliament had pointedly refused to repeal. To buy this cheap tea was to pay that tax, and to pay that tax was to concede, in the most concrete way possible, that Parliament had the authority to tax the colonies without their consent. The low price was the bait, and the acceptance of the principle was the hook. It was a bribe, essentially. Take the discount and in exchange surrender the argument you'd been fighting for nearly a decade. There was a second poison in the act, and it enraged colonial merchants specifically. By selling directly through its own hand-picked agents, called consignees, the company effectively created a monopoly. Only those favoured agents could sell the tea, cutting every other colonial merchant out of the trade entirely. Legitimate importers and smugglers alike faced ruin. And what merchant could fail to see the ominous pattern? If Parliament could hand the tea trade to a favoured monopoly today, what trade might it hand away tomorrow? Every merchant in the colonies suddenly felt the ground shift beneath his business. So the Tea Act managed the impressive feat of uniting nearly everyone against it. It threatened the merchants with monopoly and ruin. It insulted the patriots by trying to trick them into conceding the tax through cheapness. It rescued a corrupt corporation at colonial expense. And it did all this while wearing the smiling mask of a consumer discount, which somehow made it feel even more manipulative. Britain had reached for a clever, bloodless solution, and instead built a machine perfectly designed to offend every faction at once. The deepest miscalculation was one of psychology. London genuinely believed the colonists' resistance was fundamentally about money, that people griped about taxes because taxes cost them, and that cheaper tea would therefore quiet the griping. It could not grasp that the resistance was about principle, about consent, about rights. Offering cheaper tea to a people fighting over the right to consent to taxation wasn't a solution. It was proof that Britain hadn't understood a single word the colonies had been saying for years, and that misunderstanding was about to sail straight into Boston Harbor. Picture the moment the news of the Tea Act crosses the Atlantic and lands in Boston. It spreads through the taverns and print shops like fire through dry thatch. Merchants are furious, seeing a monopoly poised to crush their trade. Patriots are furious, seeing the hidden insult buried in the fine print. And ordinary people are furious, mostly on principle, which by now has become Boston's favourite hobby. Public meetings swell, newspapers roar, and the Sons of Liberty spring into action. A single defiant vow begins to ripple outward and harden into a promise. Not one chest of this tea will be unloaded, sold, or sipped on American soil. Boston has drawn its line, and the line is very, very wet. The news arrived in the autumn of 1773, carried by ship along with the unwelcome word that the tea itself was already on its way. This wasn't a distant policy debate, it was a countdown. Somewhere out on the Atlantic, vessels laden with East India Company tea were already sailing toward colonial ports, and Boston was squarely on the list. The abstract insult of the Tea Act suddenly had a very concrete, very physical form. Cargo, moving toward you, with your name on the manifest. The presses immediately caught fire, figuratively speaking. Boston's newspapers filled with furious essays denouncing the act, dissecting its every clause and warning of the tyranny it represented. Broadsides were printed and nailed up around town. The pamphleteers worked overtime, and Samuel Adams and his allies made sure that no one could mistake the Tea Act for the harmless bargain it pretended to be. They framed it exactly as it deserved to be framed, not as cheap tea, but as a Trojan horse smuggling the principle of unlimited taxation into every colonial home. Attention quickly focused on the consignees, the local agents chosen to receive and sell the tea. In Boston, several of these agents happened to be connected to Governor Hutchinson, including two of his own sons, which added a delicious layer of nepotism to the outrage. These were the men who would profit from the scheme, the human faces of the monopoly, and the Sons of Liberty went straight for them. They demanded loudly and publicly that the consignees resign their commissions and refuse to accept the tea, just as agents in other colonies were being pressured to do. In New York and Philadelphia, this pressure worked. The consignees there, facing furious crowds and the very real threat of tar and feathers, backed down and resigned, ensuring the tea ships would be turned away without incident. But Boston's consignees, shielded by their connection to the governor and stiffened by his support, refused to yield. They would not resign. They would not refuse the tea. This single fact would make all the difference, setting Boston on a collision course the other cities managed to avoid. The town organised itself with impressive speed. Mass meetings were called, drawing thousands of citizens to debate and resolve on a course of action. Committees were formed. Resolutions were passed vowing that the tea would not be landed, that no duty would be paid, and that anyone who assisted in bringing the tea ashore would be treated as an enemy of the country. This wasn't a mob forming. This was a community deliberating, deciding, and committing itself, in public and by vote, to a course of open defiance. And beneath all the meetings and resolutions and newspaper thunder ran a current of genuine dread mixed with exhilaration. Everyone understood that Boston was steering toward a direct confrontation with the Crown, the kind that could not easily be walked back. Turning the ships away peacefully, as the other ports did, would have been the safe course. But Boston's circumstances, its stubborn consignees, its stubborn governor, and its own fierce reputation were pushing it toward something far more dramatic. The line had been drawn. The tea was coming, and the whole town was bracing for the moment those two facts would meet. Now, Boston isn't alone in its fury, and it's worth pausing to see how the rest of the coast handles the crisis. In New York and Philadelphia, colonists pressure the tea consignees so relentlessly that the ships are simply turned away, sent back across the ocean with their cargo untouched. In Charleston, the tea is landed but locked away in damp warehouses to quietly rot, unsold and unwanted. Everywhere the message to Britain is the same. Take your tea and go home. It's a coordinated, continent-wide cold shoulder. But in Boston, fate has other plans, because Boston has a governor with something to prove, and a stubbornness that would soon light the whole thing on fire. The Tea Act, remember, targeted several colonial ports at once, not just Boston. The East India Company had dispatched tea to New York, Philadelphia, Charleston and Boston alike, expecting each to receive and sell it. What London got instead was a demonstration of just how thoroughly the colonies had learned to resist in concert. The committees of correspondence had done their work. Word and strategy flowed between the cities, and each prepared to reject the tea in its own fashion. This was resistance as a shared project, not a local outburst. Philadelphia set the tone early and effectively. Mass meetings there produced fierce resolutions against the tea, and the pressure on the local consignees was overwhelming. Faced with public fury and the ever-present threat of humiliation, Philadelphia's agents resigned their commissions. When the tea ship finally approached, it was met and persuaded in the firmest possible terms to turn right back around. The tea never landed. Philadelphia had solved its tea problem without a single chest touching the dock, and without a drop of anything more dramatic than strongly worded resolutions. New York followed a similar path, though a winter storm delayed its tea ship's arrival. There too the consignees were pressured into resigning, and the town made it abundantly clear that the tea would not be permitted to land or sell. When the ship at last arrived, it received the same treatment, unwelcome, unwanted, and swiftly sent back to sea. Once again, the crisis was resolved by turning the tea away intact, a peaceful if pointed rejection of Parliament's scheme. Charleston took a different but equally defiant route. There the tea was actually unloaded and brought ashore, but the consignees had resigned and no one would claim it or pay the duty. So the tea was seized by customs officials and locked away in damp storehouses, where it sat, unsold and unbought, slowly mouldering into worthlessness. The colonists hadn't destroyed it, they'd simply refused to let it enter the economy, leaving it to rot as a monument to their stubbornness. The result was the same. Britain's scheme defeated, the principle upheld, no tax paid. Notice the common thread running through all three cities. In each case, the resistance succeeded without destruction. because in each case the tea ships were either turned away before the fatal deadline or the tea was quietly neutralised. The key was that the ships could leave, or the standoff could be resolved short of open destructive confrontation. The consignees resigned, the officials relented, and everyone found a way to reject the tea while stopping just short of a truly provocative act. And this is exactly what makes Boston's story diverge so sharply and so fatefully. In Boston, the pieces that allowed the other cities their peaceful outcomes were missing. The consignees, propped up by Governor Hutchinson, refused to resign, and Hutchinson himself refused to let the tea ships leave the harbour without unloading, slamming shut the escape route that Philadelphia and New York had used. Boston would be trapped in a standoff with no peaceful exit, boxed in by a governor determined not to back down. The other ports said no and got to go home. Boston said no and found every door locked behind it. Something in Boston was going to have to break. Into Boston Harbour sail 3 ships, and you should learn their names because history certainly did. The Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. Their holds are packed with East India Company tea, and they drop anchor expecting an ordinary unloading. What they get instead is a standoff. The colonists refuse to let a single chest touch the dock. The royal officials refuse to let the ships leave without unloading. And so the vessels sit there, day after tense day, floating in the harbour like uninvited guests who won't take the hint. The whole town watches them the way you'd watch a spider on the ceiling, unwilling to look away, terrified of what happens the moment you do. The Dartmouth arrived first, at the end of November 1773, sailing into a town that had been working itself into a fever of anticipation for weeks. She was a whaling ship pressed into service as a tea carrier, and her cargo of chests made her, in the eyes of Boston, less a merchant vessel than a floating provocation. The Eleanor and the Beaver would follow over the coming days, joining her at the wharf. 3 ships, all bearing the same detested freight, all sailing straight into the heart of the storm. The moment the Dartmouth docked, the machinery of resistance whirred into motion. A mass meeting was called, drawing thousands, and it resolved in no uncertain terms that the tea would not be landed and no duty would be paid. To make sure of it, the colonists posted a volunteer watch on the wharf, a rotating guard of some 25 men keeping vigil over the ships day and night. Their job was to ensure that not a single chest was secretly slipped ashore under cover of darkness. Boston was watching, literally in shifts. Here the trap began to reveal its shape. By law, once the Dartmouth entered the harbour and formally registered her arrival, a clock started ticking. She had 20 days to unload her cargo and pay the required duties. If those 20 days elapsed with the tea still aboard, customs officials gained the legal right to seize the cargo for non-payment and unload it themselves, by force if necessary. The deadline for the Dartmouth would fall on the 16th of December. That date now hung over the entire town like a blade. The colonists' preferred solution was simple and clean: send the ships back to England, tea and all, without unloading and without paying a penny of duty. This was precisely what Philadelphia and New York had managed. If the Dartmouth and her sisters could just turn around and sail home with their cargo, the principle would be preserved and the crisis diffused without harm to anyone. The ship's owners, caught in an impossible position between a furious town and an immovable government, would have gladly complied. All they needed was permission to leave. But permission was exactly what they could not get. To clear the harbour and legally depart, the ships needed a pass from the customs authorities and ultimately the consent of Governor Hutchinson. And Hutchinson, dug in and determined, flatly refused to grant it. The ships could not legally unload because the town would not permit it. The ships could not legally leave because the governor would not allow it. They were pinned in place, caught between 2 irreconcilable forces, unable to move in any direction. And so the 3 ships sat, riding at anchor at Griffin's Wharf, laden with tea nobody would buy, guarded by colonists who would not let it land, forbidden by a governor to sail away. Every day that passed brought the December 16th deadline closer, tightening the tension another notch. The whole town felt the pressure building, the sense of an approaching collision that could no longer be avoided, only delayed. 3 ships, a locked harbour, and a ticking clock. The stage was fully set now, every piece in place. All that remained was to see how, and how violently, the deadlock would finally break. Here's where the clock starts ticking, and it ticks loudly. British law says that once a ship arrives, its cargo must be unloaded and its taxes paid within 20 days. If that deadline passes, customs officials can seize the tea by force and unload it themselves, tax and all. For the Dartmouth, that fateful deadline falls in mid-December. Suddenly this isn't a vague standoff, it's a countdown. Every passing day tightens the tension a notch, like a rope being slowly, deliberately pulled taut. The colonists know that if the tea comes ashore, even once, even by force, the principle is lost. And Boston, having built its entire identity around this principle, is in no mood to lose it now. Understand exactly what the deadline meant, because the whole drama hinges on it. When the Dartmouth registered her arrival with the customs house, she triggered a legal requirement that her cargo be entered and its duties paid within 20 days. This was ordinary commercial law, dull as ditch water under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances, and that dull clause became the most important calendar in America. It transformed an open-ended standoff into a hard, unforgiving countdown with a date attached. The 16th of December. What happened if the clock ran out mattered enormously. Once the deadline passed with duties unpaid, customs officials were legally empowered to seize the cargo for non-payment. And here was the nightmare. Seizure meant the tea would be taken into official custody and unloaded onto Boston's docks under the protection of the Customs Service, and if needed, British troops and warships. The duty would then be collected, and the tea would enter the colony. The principle the colonists had staked everything on would be broken, not by their consent, but by the mechanical operation of the law and the muzzle of a cannon. This is what made the situation so genuinely inescapable. The colonists could prevent the tea from being unloaded voluntarily. Their watch on the wharf saw to that. But they could not prevent a legal seizure once the deadline expired, not without physically fighting British soldiers and the guns of the harbour, which meant open war. The passage of time itself was the enemy. Doing nothing was not a neutral choice. Doing nothing meant the clock ran out, the tea came ashore by force, and Boston lost. So the pressure fell on finding a way to make the ships leave before the deadline, tea still aboard, duty unpaid. This was the peaceful solution, the one the other ports had achieved, and the colonists pursued it right down to the wire. They pressed the ship's owners to seek clearance to depart. The owners, terrified of the town and ruined either way, were willing. But departure required a pass from the customs officials and the governor's blessing, and that permission was being withheld with iron stubbornness. Every attempt to resolve it legally slammed into the same locked door. As the days dwindled, the atmosphere in Boston grew almost unbearable. Thousands attended meeting after meeting, debating what could be done, sending delegations to plead with officials, exploring every legal avenue. The volunteer guard kept its lonely watch on the wharf through the cold December nights, ensuring the tea stayed put. The town waited, wound tighter and tighter as the number of remaining days shrank from many to few to almost none. You could feel the deadline approaching the way you feel a storm coming, a pressure in the air, a stillness before the break. The deadline did more than create urgency. It defined the terms of everything that followed. Because the colonists could not let the clock run out and could not get the ships released, they were being funneled toward a single remaining option, whether they liked it or not. If the tea could not go home and could not be allowed to land, then the tea would have to be destroyed. The 20-day rule, that dry little clause of commercial law, was quietly authoring one of the most famous acts of defiance in history. All it needed now was for the final door to be tried and slammed one last time. Meet the man who turns a standoff into a showdown. Thomas Hutchinson, the Royal Governor of Massachusetts, and a colonist himself by birth, which somehow makes it worse. Where other governors quietly let the tea ships sail home, Hutchinson refuses. He will not grant the ships permission to leave the harbour without unloading first. Perhaps it's pride, perhaps it's principle, perhaps two of his own sons are tea consignees, and he has skin in the game. Whatever the reason, he digs in his heels like a mule at a river crossing. To Hutchinson, backing down means admitting that mobs, not the Crown, now rule Boston. His stubbornness leaves the colonists with fewer and fewer options, and eventually only one. Hutchinson was a fascinating and tragic figure, and it's worth understanding him because he was no cartoon villain. He was Massachusetts born and bred, descended from old New England stock, a man who genuinely loved his colony and had devoted his life to its service. He was intelligent, industrious, and deeply learned, the author of a respected history of Massachusetts. In a different era, he might have been remembered fondly as a distinguished native son. Instead, his story became a lesson in how a capable man's virtues, misapplied, can help detonate a revolution. The trouble was that Hutchinson believed, sincerely and unshakably, in the supremacy of Parliament and the rule of law. He thought the colonists' resistance was reckless, their arguments legally unsound, and their tactics a dangerous slide toward mob rule. Order to him was everything, and lawful authority had to be upheld even when it was unpopular, perhaps especially when it was unpopular. He had already suffered for these views. Back during the Stamp Act crisis, a mob had ransacked and destroyed his elegant home, a wound that surely hardened his resolve against ever appearing to yield to the crowd again. His personal stake in the tea only sharpened the conflict, and the colonists knew it. The consignees appointed to receive the tea in Boston included two of Hutchinson's own sons and other close associates. This meant the governor was not a neutral arbiter of the crisis. He was, in a very direct way, tied to the interests of the very men who stood to profit from the tea being landed and sold. When he refused to let the ships leave, the colonists could and did point out that he was defending his family's business as much as the Crown's authority. But it would be too simple to reduce his stubbornness to mere nepotism. Hutchinson genuinely saw the moment as a test of whether royal government could function in Massachusetts at all. If he allowed the ships to flee back to England under threat of mob violence, he believed he would be conceding that the Crown's authority meant nothing whenever a Boston crowd objected. He would be admitting that the town, not the government, held real power. For a man whose entire creed was the primacy of lawful order, that was an unthinkable surrender. So he refused the passes, refused the clearance, and refused to budge. In doing so, he unwittingly played the role the crisis needed filled. By blocking the one peaceful exit, the departure of the ships, he removed every alternative to confrontation. The colonists could not unload the tea, would not pay the tax, and now could not send the ships home. Hutchinson had, with the best of intentions and the firmest of principles, sealed off every route except destruction. He thought he was holding the line for law and order. He was in fact building the trap that would spring on the 16th of December. There is a real poignancy to Hutchinson's position, the tragedy of a loyal, intelligent man on the losing side of history, undone partly by his own rigidity. He would live to see his career destroyed, his reputation ruined among his own people, and himself driven into exile in the England he had defended, where he died homesick for the Massachusetts that had come to despise him. But all that lay ahead, for now, in December 1773, his refusal stood like a wall, and behind that wall, the pressure was building toward a single inevitable release. As the deadline looms, the whole town crams itself into the Old South Meeting House, the largest building in Boston, and still it isn't nearly big enough. Thousands pack the pews and aisles, spilling out into the frozen streets, breath fogging in the cold, voices rising with each speech. Some have walked miles through the countryside just to be here. This is democracy in its rawest, most crowded, most fire hazard adjacent form. Speaker after speaker denounces the Tea Act, and the crowd roars its approval. But beneath all the thunder runs an anxious question that nobody can quite answer. How do you stop this tea without starting an actual war? Nobody knows yet. But the answer is coming, and it's wearing feathers. The Old South Meeting House was, fittingly, a church, a large brick Puritan meeting house that doubled as the town's grandest gathering space. When Faneuil Hall proved too small for the crowds the tea crisis was drawing, the action moved here to the biggest room in Boston. There was a certain rightness to it. This was a people who took their liberties as seriously as their religion, and here they were debating the fate of an empire in the same hall where they worshipped. Politics and faith had always been tangled together in New England, and never more so than now. The meetings held here in the tense first weeks of December were extraordinary events, and not merely town meetings in the ordinary legal sense. So many people attended from Boston and the surrounding towns alike that they styled themselves the body of the people, a gathering that claimed to speak for the whole community rather than just the enfranchised voters of one town. 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 people are said to have crammed in and around the building at the peak, in a town of only 16,000 souls. This was very nearly the entire adult population, assembled and resolved. The scene inside must have been overwhelming. Bodies packed shoulder to shoulder, filling every pew, every gallery, every inch of standing room, with the overflow pressing at the doors and out into the icy street beyond. Candlelight and the fog of thousands of breaths. The rumble of the crowd rising to a roar at every fiery denunciation and falling to a tense hush when it was time to hear the latest word from the governor. It was cold, it was crowded, it was loud, and it crackled with a sense that history was being made in real time by ordinary people in an ordinary church. The speakers were the leading lights of the resistance, chief among them Samuel Adams, presiding over the proceedings with his particular genius for channeling public fury into purposeful action. Others rose to argue, to exhort, to remind the crowd of what was at stake. But this was not merely a venue for speeches, it was a genuine deliberative body, passing formal resolutions, appointing delegations, and directing the town's response with real authority. Decisions of enormous consequence were being made here by open debate and collective will, which was itself a quietly revolutionary thing. The central business of these meetings was relentless and practical: force the tea back to England. Again and again the body resolved that the tea must not land, that no duty would be paid, and that the ships must return whence they came. Delegations were dispatched to the ship owners, to the consignees, and ultimately toward the governor himself, pressing for the clearance that would let the ships depart peacefully. The meetings were the engine driving the last desperate attempts at a lawful solution, exhausting every legal avenue before the deadline slammed shut. And that is what makes the Old South Meeting House so important to the story. What happened at Griffin's Wharf on the night of December 16th was not a spontaneous riot or a drunken impulse. It was the final act of a long, orderly democratic process, the last resort reached only after thousands of people had deliberated together and watched every peaceful path close before them. The meeting house gave the coming action its legitimacy and its restraint. When the crowd finally poured out of those doors toward the harbour, they went not as a mob but as a community that had tried everything else. The talking was nearly done. The feathers were waiting. The morning of December 16th, 1773 dawns grey and bitterly cold, and everyone in Boston can feel that today is the day the rope finally snaps. It's the eve of the Dartmouth's deadline. This is the last chance. Thousands gather once more at the Old South Meeting House, waiting on one final desperate hope, that Governor Hutchinson will relent and let the ships sail away. Riders are sent to deliver the town's last plea. The crowd waits, tense and silent, in the fading afternoon light. Somewhere out in the harbour, 3 ships sit heavy with tea, and somewhere in that packed, breathless hall, a decision is quietly taking shape, one that will echo far longer than anyone in that room can possibly imagine. The day carried a terrible weight, because it was the last day. The Dartmouth's 20-day window expired at that midnight, which meant that come the following morning, customs officials could begin seizing the tea by force. Whatever was going to be done had to be done today, in these final hours. There would be no more meetings, no more delays, no more time to manoeuvre. The colonists had run out of calendar. It was resolve or surrender, and it had to be one or the other before the sun rose again. The weather matched the mood, cold and grey and raw, a proper New England December that seeped into the bones. Yet despite it, the people came, thousands upon thousands of them, streaming to the Old South Meeting House through the frozen streets. Many had come from surrounding towns, walking miles in the cold to be present for whatever was about to happen. The turnout itself was a statement. On the most dangerous day of the crisis, with confrontation looming, the people of Boston and beyond chose to show up in force, to stand together and see it through. One last hope remained, and everything hung upon it. The ship's owner, Francis Roch, a young man caught in a truly impossible position, had been dispatched to make a final personal appeal to Governor Hutchinson at his country estate, several miles outside the town. Roch was to beg for a pass allowing the Dartmouth to clear the harbour and sail for England with the tea still aboard. If Hutchinson granted it, the crisis would dissolve peacefully, the ships would leave, and the principle would be preserved. Everything, all of it, came down to one man's answer. So the great crowd in the meeting house settled in to wait, and the waiting was its own kind of agony. Speeches were made to fill the hours, but the real business was simply enduring the suspense as the short winter day bled away into darkness. Roch had to ride miles out and miles back, and the crowd could do nothing but hold together and hope. The tension in that packed, candle-lit hall must have been almost physical. Thousands of people united in a single held breath, waiting to learn whether there would be peace or something else entirely. As the afternoon faded into evening, Roch finally returned, and the hall fell silent to hear him. His news was the news everyone had feared. Hutchinson had refused. There would be no pass, no clearance, no permission for the ships to leave. The governor had held his line to the very end. Every legal avenue was now closed. The peaceful solution the town had pursued so doggedly for weeks was dead. The Dartmouth could not go home, could not be lawfully emptied, and at midnight would fall subject to seizure. The trap had sprung shut exactly as it had always threatened to. In that moment the crowd understood that the time for petitions and pleas was over. The disappointment in the hall must have been crushing, but it was disappointment shot through with a kind of grim resolve, the feeling of a decision that has finally been made for you. There was only one option left now, and everyone in that room knew what it was, even if no one had yet said it aloud. All eyes turned towards Samuel Adams, waiting for the word. The rope had snapped. What came next would be spoken in a single sentence, and understood by every soul in the building. As dusk falls, the riders return with the answer, and the answer is no. Hutchinson will not yield. The ships will not leave. The tea will be seized, and the tax collected by force. A groan of fury rolls through the crowd, and then Samuel Adams rises, and in the sudden hush he says the words everyone has been dreading and secretly waiting for. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. It's a simple sentence. It's also a signal, carefully chosen and perfectly understood. There will be no more petitions, no more speeches, no more waiting. From somewhere near the doors comes a war whoop, sharp and electric, and the crowd begins to move. The talking is over. The tea is next. Consider the weight packed into that single sentence. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. On its surface, it was almost an admission of defeat, a statement that the town's deliberations had reached their end. But every person in that hall heard the deeper meaning beneath the words. If the meeting could do nothing more, then something outside the meeting would have to be done. The lawful, orderly process had been exhausted. Now action must take its place. It was a pivot from words to deeds, delivered in the careful, deniable language of a man who knew every phrase might one day be read in a courtroom. Whether the sentence was truly a prearranged signal has been debated ever since, and that ambiguity was almost certainly the point. It's entirely possible that Adams and the inner circle of the Sons of Liberty had planned the night's action in advance, and that his words were a coded cue to begin. It's also possible the phrase simply crystallized a decision the whole crowd had already reached in their hearts. Either way, the effect was the same. The words landed, the meaning was understood, and the machinery of the night lurched into motion as if on cue. The war whoop that answered from near the doorway was the spark that lit the fuse. It cut through the packed hall, sharp and startling, a cry deliberately evocative of the mohawk disguises the men were about to don. It was a signal of its own, an announcement that the plan was underway, that the disguised parties were assembling and the moment had come. At that sound, the character of the gathering changed in an instant, from a deliberative assembly into the opening scene of an action about to unfold. The energy shifted from frustration to purpose. The crowd began to stream out of the meeting house into the cold dark, and the discipline of the moment is striking. This was not a mob dissolving into chaos and running wild through the streets. It was thousands of people moving with a shared understanding of what was about to happen and where they were meant to be. Some were participants, headed to transform themselves and go to work. Many more were spectators, drawn toward the waterfront to witness the extraordinary thing their community had decided to do. The whole town was flowing, purposefully, toward Griffin's Wharf. It's worth pausing on the sheer moral clarity of that transition. For weeks, the people of Boston had done everything the right way. They had met, debated, resolved, petitioned, and pleaded. They had pursued every lawful means of resolving the crisis and been refused at every turn by an immovable governor. Only now, with every peaceful door bolted shut, did they turn to direct action. That sequence mattered enormously, both to them and to how history would judge them. This was defiance earned through exhausted patience, not impulsive violence. And so the signal did its work. The meeting broke, the crowd moved, and the men who had a task to perform slipped away to prepare themselves for it. The long weeks of talking had funneled down to this single point, this one irreversible turn. There would be no undoing what was about to be done, no walking it back, no explaining it away as a misunderstanding. Boston had chosen, collectively and deliberately, to destroy the tea. All that remained was the disguise, the walk to the wharf, and the cold, methodical work of the hatchets. The signal had been given. The country's course had turned. Now comes one of the strangest, most theatrical details of the whole night. The disguises. As men slip out into the darkness, many of them smear soot and grease across their faces, drape themselves in rough blankets, and jam feathers into their hair in a crude imitation of Mohawk warriors. Let's be clear, nobody is actually fooled. No sensible person mistakes a sooty Boston Cooper for an indigenous warrior. The disguise isn't meant to trick anyone. It's a symbol, a shedding of the ordinary self, a way of becoming something new and defiant for one dangerous night. It's also, practically speaking, a very sensible way to avoid being personally recognized and hanged. Symbolism and self-preservation, hand in hand. Let's start with the practical purpose, because it was real and it mattered. What these men were about to do was a serious crime, the deliberate destruction of an enormous quantity of private property belonging to a powerful corporation under the Crown's protection. It was, arguably, treason. If identified, the participants could face ruinous lawsuits, imprisonment or worse. A smear of soot and a blanket over the shoulders offered at least some cover, some deniability, some blurring of individual faces in the dark. In a town where everyone knew everyone, a little anonymity was worth a great deal. But the disguises were far too flimsy to be taken seriously as actual attempts at concealment, and everyone understood that. A layer of soot and some feathers wasn't going to fool your own neighbours, especially not the many spectators who knew perfectly well who was climbing aboard those ships. This was disguise as gesture, disguise as theatre. Its real work was symbolic, and the symbolism was carefully chosen. By costuming themselves, however crudely, as something other than ordinary Bostonians, the men mark the night as extraordinary, set apart from ordinary life and ordinary law. The specific choice of Mohawk imagery carried layers of meaning worth unpacking, some of them uncomfortable to modern eyes. In part, it was about identity. The indigenous peoples of America were, to the colonists, powerful symbols of the American land itself, of a fierce independence rooted in this continent rather than in Europe. By adopting native dress, the colonists were making a statement about who they were becoming, not transplanted Englishmen, but Americans native to this place, no longer bound by the mother country across the sea. It was a costume of self-definition. There was, of course, a darker and more troubling dimension to this, which honesty requires us to note. The colonists were appropriating an identity that was not theirs, reducing a real and living people to a symbol, a mask to be worn for a night and discarded. The Mohawk themselves had no part in this, and no say in being used as its emblem. It's one of those historical details that sits awkwardly against the noble narrative, a reminder that even a celebrated act of principle carried within it the casual assumptions of its age. The men who wore those feathers did not think twice about it. History has, rightly, thought about it since. The transformation itself, though, must have been a powerful thing to experience. Picture it. Ordinary tradesmen, apprentices and merchants, men with families and shops and reputations, stepping into a doorway or an alley and emerging as something else. The soot went on, the blankets settled over the shoulders, the feathers were fixed in place, and with them perhaps came a kind of permission, a shedding of the cautious, law-abiding self and the taking on of a bolder identity for the space of a few hours. Costume has always had that power, to free people to do what they might not dare to do as themselves. So the disguise was many things at once, and that's precisely what makes it such a perfect emblem of the whole night. It was practical protection and symbolic declaration. It was a mask to hide behind and a costume to become someone through. It was self-preservation and self-definition, fused into soot and feathers, and when the disguised men had gathered in their little companies in the dark, faces blackened, blankets drawn tight, they were ready. They no longer looked quite like the respectable citizens of Boston. They looked like something new and dangerous, which was exactly the point. Now they turn toward the water. By dozens they make their way through the shadowed streets toward Griffin's Wharf, where the 3 ships wait in the black water. Word has spread, and a crowd of spectators gathers along the docks, silent and watchful, breath hanging in the frozen air. This is no drunken riot. There's no shouting, no chaos, no chanting, just the crunch of boots, the creak of rope, and the cold slap of harbour water against the hulls. The men move with an eerie, deliberate calm, like people who have rehearsed this in their heads 100 times. British warships sit nearby, cannons and all, yet nobody moves to stop them. Onto the ships the disguised men climb, and the most famous tea party in history quietly begins. The march to the wharf set the tone for everything that followed. The disguised parties, perhaps 100 or more men in several groups, moved through Boston's dark streets not as a wild, rampaging horde, but with an orderly, purposeful quiet. There was a discipline to it that must have been unsettling to witness, a controlled intensity. These were men on a mission they had accepted with clear eyes, and they carried themselves accordingly, saving their energy and their nerve for the work ahead. The very calm of it made it more serious, not less. At the wharf, an enormous crowd had gathered to watch. Thousands of Bostonians, drawn from the meeting house and from their homes, lined the waterfront in the freezing December night. They did not interfere, did not cheer, did not riot. They simply watched, a vast, silent audience to the drama unfolding on the ships. That silence is one of the most haunting details of the whole event. It speaks to the gravity everyone attached to what was happening, a shared understanding that this was no lark, but a solemn and irreversible act of defiance being witnessed by the community that had willed it. The physical setting pressed in on all sides. It was bitterly cold, the harbour water black and frigid, the ships looming dark against the night. And crucially, British power was right there, close enough to touch. Warships of the Royal Navy lay at anchor in the harbour, bristling with cannon, manned by crews under the command of officers sworn to uphold the Crown's authority. British troops were in the town. By every ordinary expectation, an act of open destruction of Crown-protected property, carried out in full view, should have brought swift and violent intervention. The guns were right there. And yet no intervention came, and the reasons for that restraint are telling. The naval commanders and the customs officials found themselves in an impossible position. To open fire on the ships or send troops onto the wharf would have meant slaughtering colonists in the heart of Boston, igniting the very war that no one on either side was quite ready to start on that December night. The crowd was enormous. The situation was volatile beyond measure. Faced with the choice between allowing the destruction or triggering a massacre and likely a war, the authorities chose for the moment to stand down and watch. Their inaction spoke volumes about how far the balance of real power in Boston had already shifted. So the men climbed aboard the Dartmouth, the Eleanor and the Beaver, boarding all 3 ships in an organised fashion, each group assigned to its vessel. The few crew members still aboard offered no resistance. They were simply pushed gently aside and by most accounts treated without harm. This was not an assault on the sailors or the ships themselves. It was a precise targeted operation aimed at one thing and one thing only, the tea. The men knew exactly what they had come to do and exactly what they had not come to do, and the distinction was about to be demonstrated with remarkable clarity. There is something almost dreamlike about the scene when you hold it all in your mind at once. The frozen dark, the silent watching thousands, the black water, the looming warships holding their fire, and the disguised men moving with quiet, rehearsed purpose across the decks. It was theatre and crime and history all fused into a single tableau, lit by the cold and hushed by the weight of what everyone knew was about to happen. The stage was set exactly as it had to be. The audience was assembled, and now, chest by chest, the performance would begin. And so the tea settles to the bottom of the harbour, and our long night in Boston draws gently to a close. Let your shoulders drop. Let the day loosen its grip. There's nothing left to do now but drift. Think back over everything you survived tonight. You woke in a cold, damp house, in a crooked little town, dressed in scratchy wool, and stepped out into streets that smelled of low tide and horses. You worked for your living against wind and weather, and a parliament an ocean away that kept reaching into your pockets uninvited. You watched anger build, year by year, tax by tax, from grumbling in the taverns to blood on the cobblestones to 3 ships sitting silent in a frozen harbour. And then, on one bitter December night, you watched ordinary tradesmen and shopkeepers do something quietly extraordinary, with soot on their faces and hatchets in their hands. It's easy, from the warmth of the present, to forget how frightening it all was. These were real people, cold and uncertain, with families and shops and everything to lose, choosing principle over comfort and consequence. They didn't know they were making history. They only knew they'd run out of other options, and that some things are worth more than a cup of tea. So tonight, as you sink into your soft bed with the heat humming and the door safely locked, maybe spare a quiet thought for them. For the stubborn, the hopeful, the slightly ridiculous people who stood in the freezing dark and refused to back down so that the world might turn out a little differently. Because history is messy and cold and often unfair, but it's also proof that ordinary people, when they decide to, can be braver than they ever imagined. Rest now. You've earned it. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time.